To understand this argument, I'm presenting you with a scenario, and as you listen, assuming anyone is actually listening, at all times I want you to try to stay personally situated in this scenario. I'm not talking about the decisions of employers in aggregate and workers in aggregate. I want you to think about the decisions that you individually would actually make. Okay? So here's the scenario. You're looking for a babysitter, right? You're looking for a babysitter for your kids. You get two applicants for the position. One of them is a middle-aged woman. Let's say she's a local middle-aged woman with loads of experience, loads of references, speaks the language. The other applicant is, let's say, a 17-year-old boy. Okay, he's a 17-year-old boy. Let's say he's not local. He speaks broken English or whatever language you speak. He doesn't, speak very well. He's got no references at all. But he seems like a good kid. I mean, he's a good boy. You can tell. He says he's got lots of younger siblings who he's grown up taken care of. So, and you believe him. But he's nevertheless a 17-year-old boy, speaks broken English, doesn't have any references. Okay, let's call the woman Anne, and we'll call this boy Billy, right? So, let's imagine that you have to choose one of these applicants, right? And I really want you to put yourself in this situation and think about who you personally would choose, right? So, I'm going to assume, remember, these are your kids, okay? I'm going to assume that all else being equal, and that's a very important term that you should keep in mind, all else being equal, you're going to choose Anne, okay? And actually, it doesn't really matter who you choose. That's not really the point, but the point is you have a preference. You are not indifferent to these two options. In terms of economics, they are not on the same indifference curve, right? There is. So, you have a preference for one or the other, and I'm going to assume that your preference is for Anne. But now let's imagine that they're charging different prices. Let's say Anne is charging 50 credits an hour, right? And Billy is offering to do the job for only 5 credits an hour. And let's say that for you, 50 credits an hour is a bit of a stretch. Like, it's a lot. Whereas 5 credits an hour you can afford easily, right? Not a problem. Do you admit that whether or not you change your decision as to who to hire, or perhaps even change your decision to go out and have a babysitter at all, it has an effect, right? You are that much more likely to choose Billy over Anne, right? The point is that to the extent that Billy lacks competitive, marketable skills and experience, to the extent that he is unable to compete with Anne in terms of skills and experience, he relies on his ability to compete on the basis of price. In a sense, that is the only bargaining chip that he has. Okay? The fact that he can, to use a rather ominous term, can undercut Anne is the only bargaining chip he really has. Otherwise, how's he going to compete, right? So now let's say that a law is passed that says babysitters must charge no less than 30 credits an hour, okay? So now, same situation. Anne is still charging 50 credits an hour, right? Because she knows that if you don't pay her 50 credits an hour, she can find someone else. She's got lots of skills and experience, and people are quite willing to employ her, right? Otherwise, she wouldn't be asking that much in the first place. So, so we've got this 30 credits an hour minimum wage for babysitters, and Anne is still charging 50 credits an hour, but what about Billy? Well, now Billy was asking for 5 credits an hour, and at that price, you were perhaps willing to employ him, give him a chance. He seems like a good lad. Give him a chance. But now you have no choice but to pay him 30 credits an hour. Okay, still a bit cheaper than Anne, but is that cheaper and by enough to outweigh the advantage that Anne has? Remember, Anne is your preferred candidate. So it stands to reason that this law, which means that Billy must charge more, makes you that much less likely to hire him, and it makes life more difficult for him. It does not in any way guarantee that he's now going to make 30 credits an hour, because if he could charge 30 credits an hour, he'd already be doing it. Okay? So Billy suffers from this law. Now, what about Anne? You could argue that Anne benefits. Okay, she does benefit in a sense, because she's given that much extra shielding from Billy's competition. And in fact, that is historically the purpose of the minimum wage, and is still, I've had debates with so many people over this. This is still very much why a lot of people support it. If you talk to a British builder, let's say, like I had a friend a few years back who coincidentally was called Billy. A nice boy. I really liked him, right? And he was a sort of white working class English lad, and he worked on a building site. And I remember him telling me how he supported rules like minimum wage and so on, because they protect labourers like him, local, skilled, or reasonably skilled, working within certain sort of safety standards, let's say, with minimum standards, that kind of thing, protects them from what he perceives as unfair competition, i.e. being undercut by what he perceives as, less skilled, as sort of, unqualified competition. Okay, so even people who support the minimum wage often don't truly support it because they think it helps the people at the very bottom of the labour market. On the contrary, they support it because it helps people like them, themselves, who are not quite at the bottom of the labour market, who are maybe sort of somewhere, I don't know, not at the top, perhaps not even at the middle, but certainly not at the very bottom. Okay, so yeah, the minimum wage may help Anne insofar as it shields her from competition from Billy, and maybe you assume that Billy is some foreigner who lives 10 people in one room and is just basically scum. Okay, but putting aside any moral questions about xenophobia and racism and so on, that argument still doesn't work, because there's no reason to assume that he isn't. I said in my scenario that he's not local, but what if he was local? It wouldn't make any difference. Yeah, so Billy, he could represent a foreigner, an immigrant, but he could just represent a local person. It doesn't make any difference. But yes, you could argue that Anne benefits, but even the idea that Anne benefits requires qualification, because she only benefits in a very narrow sense. She benefits insofar as she continues to do exactly the job that she's doing. But what if Anne aspires to do something other than being a babysitter? Maybe Anne would like to build on her skills and experience and become and start an agency. Maybe she'd like to hire less experienced babysitters, people like Billy, and expand on that. This new law that says that people like Billy have to charge at least 30 credits an hour, it makes it much harder for her to build such a business. So yeah, it protects her in the narrow sense she is a babysitter, but what if she aspires to more than that? And that's a very important issue, because I think a lot of mistakes people make in their reasoning on economic questions comes down to a sort of semantic fallacy, where we all do it, we're very prone to this, where we confuse categories, sort of linguistic categories, for real meaningful human categories, right? So you take the idea of a worker, okay? We are not ants, we are not bees. There are no worker people. There are men, there are women, there are people with brown hair, there are people with red hair, but there are no workers, there are no capitalists, there are no, employers, right? These are not truly kinds of person. Rather, these are activities, these are choices that we make in response to the various incentives around us, okay? Now, I don't want you to accuse me of being disingenuous. I realise that, people are born into a certain social class, and it affects the choices they make, and there may be prejudices and so on and so forth, right? But fundamentally, being a worker or a capitalist means that you've chosen to engage in a certain activity, right? So laws like the minimum wage, you might look at some data, some statistics that say that it's benefited workers, but maybe it's benefited workers only in the sense that in our scenario, this minimum wage has benefited Anne. It's benefited her only in this narrow sense, whereby she continues to engage in that particular activity. But it hasn't really benefited her in the broader sense of her total sort of human life. Yeah, so, there are lies, damn lies in statistics. So you must be careful when thinking about categories like workers and capitalists. To give you another sort of example, think about this. Imagine a policy to make the average IQ of the human race increase. Now, on the face of it, that seems like a pretty good idea, right? So here's the policy. We kill everyone in the world except Richard Dawkins. Now, if we do that, if everyone drops dead except Richard Dawkins, then the average IQ of mankind has increased. But that doesn't make it a good policy. Okay? In no way is that a good policy. In fact, if a policy that leads to a general increase in IQ is kind of a red flag. You should think, well, how did that happen? Well, by the same token, a policy that leads to an average increase in workers' wages should be something of a red flag. How did that happen? Because if you simply eliminate people like Billy from the labour market, you just prohibit any labour taking place that makes below a certain wage. Well, then you've increased the average income of these people we categorize as workers. But that doesn't make it a good policy. Okay? So I hope that has cleared some things up. Basically, as I said, think about the choices you would make. If you had to employ somebody, you have to choose between different applicants. You have a preference, but the amount that they're charging is not irrelevant. It matters. It affects your ultimate choice. And to the extent that someone has difficulty competing in terms of skills and experience, they depend on being able to compete on the basis of price. And the lower they are in the marketplace, like the closer they are to the very bottom of the labour market, the harder off their life is, basically, the more this is true. And so the more they are hurt by minimum wage. Okay? And in fact, this is not just true for minimum wage, it's true for all labour laws, because they all basically do the same thing, which is to increase the sort of price floor on hiring someone. Well, I think that'll do for now. So If you did in fact listen to this all the way through, or even for a few minutes, then I thank you very much, and maybe I'll make another video soon. Bye bye.